Hey, what's going on everybody? It's Mr. Buddy here, bringing you guys a small trivia video of sorts. This isn't a Pokemon theory by any means, and it's not really a Pokemon mystery either. It's just going to be me talking about and explaining a topic that I've noticed has a ton of confusion around it, especially in the comment section of some of my videos. Today I want to explore some of the name confusion that happens with a couple of the Generation 1 Pokemon trainers. A lot of it has to do with the Gen 1 rival, but there's also another character who causes some name confusion as well. I'm going to try to break all of this confusion down, where it all comes from, why people get confused, and what the so-called correct names for these characters are. So let's not waste any more time and get to it. For whatever reason, people lately have been telling me that I'm calling a specific trainer by the wrong name. This guy right here is who I receive almost daily comments about. For myself, and most likely many people watching this video, we know him as Blue, but there's also a group of people who call the same character Green and insist that they're in the right for calling him that. Well, what gives? Why do people call this character two different names, and who's right in what they call him? Well, this is something that rarely happens on the internet, but in this case, everyone is right. This character can be called either Blue or Green, and it's entirely correct either way. The reason for this is actually pretty simple, and is linked to the original Pokemon games release. In Japan, the first Pokemon games that released were Pokemon Red and Pokemon Green on February 27, 1996. In the games, we got our first look at the player character and rival, and at the time they didn't actually have official names yet. The player was referred to as Satoshi in some of the marketing, but overall the characters didn't have official names, and you were allowed to name both of them whatever you wanted. Fast forwarding a little bit into the future, it wasn't until Generation 2 that they had official canon names, which were Red for the player character and Green for the rival. The reason these particular names were chosen was to match the original games that had released which they were first introduced in, Pokemon Red and Pokemon Green. I actually find their names being based off of the original Pokemon games to be kind of a neat idea, and it makes sense. Nothing too confusing so far, right? Well, things are unfortunately about to get a little bit more complicated. Eventually, roughly 2.5-ish years after Pokemon Red and Green released, it was finally time to unleash Pokemon upon the rest of the world. Rather than just releasing a translated Red and Green version, it was decided that Pokemon Red and Pokemon Blue would release in all of the other countries. One thing you should know about Pokemon Blue is that it actually released in Japan after Red and Green and was considered to be, in a sense, a version 2.0 of the original games. Pokemon Blue in Japan featured updated code, redesigned sprites, and improved sound, and the decision was made that they would translate this Japanese Pokemon Blue into other languages, as well as make a version of Pokemon Red based off of this updated Blue version to release worldwide as a pair. These two games were released, and with them came a whole bunch of localization adjustments, such as altered dialogue, as well as many of the minor characters getting name changes. It wasn't just the smaller characters that would receive new names though, as Pokemon Red and Blue releasing, rather than Red and Green, actually influenced the rival's name. As we've talked about, the rival was named Green in Japan to reference one of the two original games that released in the country. Since the rest of the world got Pokemon Red and Blue, rather than Red and Green, the rival's name was changed to Blue outside of Japan to better match with the original games that we got. I mean, it wouldn't make sense to have the rival's name be Green since we didn't even get Pokemon Green released here, right? This name change was reflected in every area outside of Japan. The US, Germany, France, you name it. Everywhere Pokemon Red and Blue released as a pair, his name was officially changed to Blue. Honestly, I could get into a pretty passionate discussion about how they really didn't need to change its name for the games outside of Japan, but in truth I feel like, at the time, their decision made a lot of sense. They wanted his worldwide name to have the same principle behind it that the Japanese name had, and changing it to Blue ultimately made more sense than keeping it Green. That's not to say that changing his name didn't cause any confusion, though. This character still goes by these two different names today, and there can definitely be some miscommunication when trying to talk about this character with somebody who refers to him as Blue, while you may call him Green, or vice versa. All in all, though, this guy can be called either Blue or Green, it's entirely correct either way, and people will most likely know who you're talking about. And that's just a quick overview on the Generation 1 rivals' different names. As I mentioned at the start of the video, however, there's still one other character I want to talk about, and she's actually caused a lot of confusion in her own way. This is all still partially related to Blue/Green, but we're actually going to be talking about this female character right here now. In early promo art for Pokemon Red and Green, this girl can be seen included alongside the main characters. In the final game, she is nowhere to be found, but it's been theorized that she was going to be a main character, or perhaps a female player option, due to how she had one of the starters in the artwork. Once again, she never appears at all in the Generation 1 games, but that didn't stop a character based off of her from appearing in one of the big Pokemon mangas at the time. The Pokemon Special manga, which is awesome by the way, featured a character directly based off of this unknown and unused character, and what more, this mysterious girl was actually one of the main characters. The thing about this manga version of the girl that's the most interesting to us right now is her name. In the manga, the protagonists are named based on the Pokemon game's titles. For example, a character based off of Dawn appears but is named Platinum, a character based off of Brendan appears but is named Ruby, and so on. This mysterious girl falls into that same naming scheme and is named, at least in Japan, Blue, to correspond with the Blue version released. Characters named after Red and Green already existed, so Blue was really the only game name left that she could take. The manga started to get more and more popular, and at this point the name Blue for this girl began to circulate outside of the manga community, to the point where people actually dubbed the unused female character from the promo art Blue as well, even though she was an unused character with no official name. After this happened, many people started to like the idea that this girl, alongside the main character and rival from the original games, were all named after the Gen 1 titles, and so the name Blue stuck and became one of the popular names for this unknown character. Alright, let's go back to the manga briefly. When it finally released outside of Japan, the character naming situation was sort of messed up, and it all came from this guy right here having two different names. I mentioned before how in the games, Green's name was changed to Blue outside of Japan, but what's also interesting was that the name of the manga character based off of him had his name changed to Blue as well. The problem with having him being named Blue in the manga was that, like we just talked about, there was already a character named Blue in the Japanese translation. Because of this, they had to change the girl's name outside of Japan to Green, effectively swapping these two characters' names across different translations of the manga. On top of that, remember how I mentioned before that in Japan the manga girl's name got popular enough to warrant being used to refer to both the manga character and the potentially cut game character? Well, the same thing happened with her again outside of Japan, but this time she was known by the name of Green to people. This is definitely where people get confused the most. With the names of these two characters essentially being switched between Japan and the rest of the world, it's led to a bunch of confusion. For me personally, I go by what they're called in the West, which means that this guy is Blue and the girl is Green, but many people out there know them by the opposite, which is entirely fine too. Fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately, there's one final thing to address when talking about all of the Gen 1 name confusion. For this point, we'll actually need to take a trip to Generation 3 and look at something Game Freak added in that sort of helps conform all of the names, at least regarding the female character. While I did say that we were going to look at Gen 3, we're not actually going to be looking at Ruby, Sapphire, or Emerald, but instead taking a look at the Generation 1 remakes, Fire Red and Leaf Green. Among all of the changes and updates that were put into the games, the core story remained the same, which by extension meant that the characters were pretty much the same. The player character was still red, your rival was still called Green in Japan and Blue everywhere else, and everything seemed almost unchanged. Except for one thing. Fire Red and Leaf Green finally added the option to choose which gender you wanted to play the game as, and furthermore, the female player character seemed to be based off of the old unused character of Gen 1, just with an updated design. People were fervently waiting for her official name to be revealed, and while they waited, they called her Blue/Green, just like they called this character before. The problem with calling her these names, however, is that they're not correct. In fact, none of the names people call her are right because she doesn't actually have an official name. Since her initial reveal alongside Red, she was just known as the female player character rather than anything specific. People assumed that once the game's released, we'd know her official name, but when the games eventually came out, we found out that she didn't actually get one. Even digging through press releases and official info showed that this girl didn't get any kind of legitimate name. Before you start feeling bad for her, don't worry. Fans came to her rescue and came up with a brand new name for her, and surprisingly, it wasn't Blue or Green. I'm sure that tons of you guys out there have heard her called this before, but the name people came up with was Leaf. The origin of this name for her actually comes from within the game's coding, rather than the title of Leaf Green, which people usually assume. Within the game's trainer data, the placeholder name for this character is titled Leaf, which is where people got the idea to call her this name. This is, to my knowledge, the name that most people call her by today, at least in the West. To be honest, I'm actually kind of glad that there's sort of a uniform name we can call her now that's different from the manga version's Blue or Green. There was just a ton of confusion with all of the different names, and just calling her Leaf is a lot easier than using one of her other names and risking all of the confusion you'll bring. Actually, speaking of those other names, there are people out there that still prefer to call this character Blue or Green rather than Leaf. The reason why is that the trainer placeholder names might not be an accurate representation of a character's actual name. Some of the characters can have some pretty strange placeholder names, such as how Blue's placeholder name is Terry, which is a name he's never been known to go by in any version of the character. Because of this, many people just prefer to still call this girl either Blue or Green, as they feel that it's a little bit more fitting than Leaf. Alright, so this has been a video explaining some of the trainer name confusion that happens surrounding some of the Gen 1 Pokemon characters. To sum it all up briefly, this guy is called Green in Japan and Blue everywhere else. This girl is called Blue in Japan and Green everywhere else, and is also commonly referred to as Leaf from Generation 3 onwards. If there's one thing to take away from this video, then just know that all of these names are perfectly correct and fine for these characters. If I call the Gen 1 rival Green, then that's totally okay, or if somebody calls this girl Blue and somebody else calls her Leaf, that's alright too. Character names in Pokemon, at least regarding the Gen 1 characters, can be pretty confusing, so hopefully this video helped explain and clarify these characters' names, as well as where the confusion comes from. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you later.